Today, after an 18-month delay, the government published its draft domestic abuse bill, which amongst other things aims to make it easier to prosecute perpetrators of both physical and emotional abuse and provide more support to victims. You might think that in pushing ahead with the bill at all in the light of the ongoing Brexit shambles, the government is showing how serious it is about tackling domestic abuse. You might be forgiven for thinking that we've already got Demand 3 sorted, but I'm not at all convinced. Research accompanying the draft bill estimated that the social cost of domestic abuse alone in 1 year, in the year ending 2017, March 2017, was £66 billion, of which £724 million was spent on victim services in the same period. According to Women's Aid, that works out at just £362 per person who's a survivor accessing direct support services. And I can tell you now, as somebody running a women's charity, that really doesn't go very far. NIA, the charity I work for, was one of many that responded to the consultation that preceded the draft bill. One of the main concerns that we expressed was that the government was even considering a domestic abuse bill, rather than a violence against women and girls bill, when the government has a strategy to end violence against women and girls. So the bill is already a backward step. In fact, the UK has signed but not ratified the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. That's a major international framework targeting the prevention of violence against women and girls, victim protection, and ending the impunity of perpetrators. Ratifying the Istanbul Convention requires states to recognise that violence against women and girls is a result of sex inequality. I think it's very telling that Westminster wouldn't ratify that, or hasn't yet. It's true that sexual and domestic violence and abuse and prostitution cross boundaries of sex, social class, ethnicity and culture, but that doesn't mean that there aren't differences in terms of perpetrators and experiences of abuse across these characteristics. There are differences as well as commonalities in the forms and rates of violence, and equally critically, differences in the ways that we can access safety, support and justice. It certainly doesn't mean, as many claim, including everything that I've seen written about in the draft proposed bill, which includes a proposed new definition of domestic abuse, that domestic abuse recurs regardless of gender. Regardless of gender. Not only is this failing to recognise that sex and gender are not the same thing, and that it is sex, not gender, that is the protected characteristic, it fails to acknowledge that socially constructed gender plays one of the most critical roles in maintaining and justifying sex inequality. The most recent crime survey for England and Wales recorded that 8% of women and girls, that's 1 in 12, aged 16 to 59, were subject to domestic violence and abuse, roughly 3/4 from a partner or ex-partner in 1 year last year. That equates to an estimated 1.3 million victims, female victims in 1 year, and that even includes the insult of not bothering to count any woman aged 60 or above, which is about a quarter of adult women. At the same time, police recorded almost 54,000 rapes, and they estimated that there were 151,000 rapes. Of those, about 8,000 victims were male and 141,000 were females. Yet, regardless of who the victim is, when rape is reported to the police, 99% report that their rapist was a male. And a woman is killed by a man in the UK every 3 days. A woman's killed by a partner or ex-partner every 4 days. I don't have time tonight to tell you about how difficult it is to keep a small independent charity supporting women and girls financially viable. Suffice to say that now, like every time of this year, we're looking at our budget for the next financial year, and we've got a deficit budget that if we don't significantly outperform, we'll be out of business within 12 months. This is normal for us now. Normal, but it's no way to develop and run services, and the funding that we do get comes with ever more challenging targets, which prevent us from supporting women in the ways that we know that they need, and anyway, we don't have enough services to meet demand. There are now over 500 refuges in the UK, with community-based support available in many towns and cities. There are 44 rape crisis centres in England and Wales. The money spent on victim services would have been inconceivable to the women in the 1970s who started setting up such services, but the reality is that it really isn't enough. An estimated 21,084 referrals to refuges in England alone were declined last year. That's an average of over 400 declined each week, mostly due to lack of space. And the average waiting list for rape crisis counselling is 6 months. At NIA, where I work, we run East London Rape Crisis. The waiting list for counselling is 10 months. In effect now, most services developed by women, for women, are owned by local authorities through contracts. Through competitive tendering, local authorities decide... Oh, I thought you would give me the time. Through competitive tendering, local authorities decide what services are needed and who is best placed to provide them. And too often they've decided that low cost, one size fits all, is more important than small independent women-led women-centred specialist organisations supporting only women. They often demand that we provide services to men. We're faced when we bid for contracts with either going for a service that includes services for men or not going at all. And if we don't go at all, then we face going out of business. NIA, the organisation I work for, last week submitted a bid to run services in a London local authority. That bid is weighted 70% on the cost of the service that we bid for and 30% on the quality of the bid. 30% on quality, 70% on cost. It just disgusts me. Independent research repeatedly finds out that women who've been subject to men's violence fare better in women-only spaces. Women-only spaces offer not only a physical, but also a psychological and emotional escape from men's domination, control and violence, away from the specific man that we're escaping or who's violated us, away from men in general, away from men's control and demands for attention, away from the male gaze and the way that they feel entitled to judge and rate us, a space we all share, a space in which we can all share in common our experiences of abuse, as well as the differences between us. Many women and children that we work with, but not all of them, are terrified of males. And yes, this includes males who identify as transgender. One of the most important ways that we can contribute to creating a safe space for women and girls who've experienced men's violence is quite simply by keeping men out. It's partly about women's psychological... It's partly about the psychological benefit to women created by a women-only space, but it's also about simple statistics. As I outlined earlier, most sexual and domestic violence, including prostitution, is perpetrated by men against women, and there's no credible evidence to suggest that trans-identified males commit crimes of violence against women, girls and children at rates any different to those of other males. And there's also plenty of evidence to indicate strong links between trans activists and the pro-sex trade lobby. This is not about lack of compassion with male victims or people who identify as trans. In fact, it's not about trans people at all. It's about women. It's about not denying anyone's human rights, anyone's privacy and dignity. Of course it's not. But it's about fighting for women's human rights, our right to safety, our privacy, our dignity, and for some of us, the right to life itself. It's about recognising that women have sex-based rights and protections for a reason. If we look at sexual and domestic violence and prostitution outside of sex inequality, we'll never be working with the root causes and therefore only ever tinkering about with the surface, dealing with the symptoms. Relationships and sex education that ignores this context will have a very limited impact on prevention, regardless of whether or not it's mandatory. I started by talking about the new domestic abuse bill and whether that could mean that our demand for number 3 is already redundant. But when I read the press release from Number 10, circulated yesterday to announce today's bill, I noticed something that chilled me to the bones. The press release, and I stress it's the press release, not the actual bill itself, but even so, the press release from Number 10 Downing Street to announce the launch of the draft domestic abuse bill did not mention the words woman, women, or female once. Not once. We will never end men's violence against women, girls and children if we don't know the difference between sex and gender, if we don't develop our responses across all forms of men's violence against women and girls, and if we minimise in any way the sex differences in perpetration and victimisation of sexual and domestic violence and abuse, including prostitution.